The needle went in. The machine beeped. Then it beeped again, and the sound was wrong, too short, too sharp, like a question that expected no answer. Mara Voss kept her eyes on the wall. Gray composite paneling, the same gray that covered every surface in Transit Hub Velian 9, the kind of gray that wasn't chosen so much as surrendered to. She had been staring at it for 11 minutes while the Veth-class screener processed her xenobiological intake, the standard blood panel every human immigrant had to clear before stepping 1 foot into registered galactic transit. She had done this twice before, at Sector 4. At the Outer Rim processing post, whose name she could never pronounce, and had stopped trying to. Both times the needle went in, the machine beeped once and she walked through. This time the machine beeped 3 times. Then it stopped making sound entirely, and the screener, 12-fingered, professionally blank, the kind of face that had processed 10,000 humans and stopped seeing any of them, looked at his screen. Then looked at it again. His 12 fingers hovered above the controls without touching anything. Mara said, "Is there a problem?" He did not answer. She watched one of his pens roll off the edge of the counter, then another. He didn't notice. She noticed. She noticed the way you notice small things when larger things are trying to get your attention and you are not ready to give it. "Hey," she said, "the pens." He called a supervisor. The supervisor was Cedral, 4-armed, gray-skinned, built like someone had stacked 2 people and called it one, and she came through the side door fast, which was the first thing that felt wrong. Supervisors didn't come fast. Supervisors came when they felt like it, which was usually after you had been standing long enough that your knees had filed a formal complaint. This one moved like she had been waiting by the door. She looked at the screen. She looked at Mara. "Ms. Voss." "That's me. Please come with me." Mara looked at her blood still in the intake tube, a small dark line of it, ordinary-looking, the color of nothing unusual, and then she followed. The room they put her in was not a holding cell. That was the detail that settled in her chest and stayed there. Holding cells had hard benches and recycled air that smelled like other people's nerves. This room had a cushioned chair, a small table, a cup of water that was actually cold. Nobody gave you cold water in a holding cell. She sat in the cushioned chair and drank the cold water and stared at the table and thought about Ohio. Not for any emotional reason, just because Ohio was the last place she had understood the rules. The door opened 23 minutes later. The man who walked in was human, or close enough that the differences weren't visible. Late 50s, she guessed. The kind of face that had made a lot of careful decisions and was about to make another one. He wore a research division badge she didn't recognize, which meant it was above the clearance level she had ever been close enough to read. He set a file on the table between them and sat down without introducing himself, which told her everything about how this conversation was going to go. Then she saw the name on the file. Not her name. Her mother's. Carol Voss. Written in the standard Galactic Registry font, clean and impersonal, the same font used for cargo manifests and extinction records, and everything the administration considered equally worth documenting. Mara looked at the file. She looked at her own hands. She put her hands flat on the table, not touching it. "Ms. Voss," the man said. "You have my mother's name in a file," Mara said, "in a galactic transit hub, in a room with a cushioned chair." She paused. "My mother was a librarian in Darrow County, Ohio. She drove a 12-year-old truck and grew tomatoes that never came in right and watched too much television." Another pause. "So I'm going to need you to explain the file." He folded his hands. "When did your mother pass?" 6 days ago." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise. The opposite of surprise, recognition. The kind that comes from already knowing an answer and needing to hear it confirmed. "How?" "Heart failure." Mara kept her voice level. She was good at level. She had been practicing level her whole life without knowing why she needed to be so good at it. She was 61. The doctors said it was fast. They said she likely didn't feel much. She looked at the file. Why does a Galactic Transit Authority have a file with my mother's name on it? We are not Transit Authority, he said. No, Mara said. I figured that out when you gave me cold water. He almost smiled, just almost. My name is Dr. Owen Ferris. I am a xenogeneticist attached to the Interspecies Biological Registry, Classified Division. He opened the file, not to show her, just to confirm what was in it for himself, the way people confirm a thing they already know because they need the paper to make it real. Ms. Voss, your blood panel triggered a level 7 biological flag. That flag is attached to a species designation that hasn't been active in the registry for approximately 400 years. Mara was quiet. The water in her cup was still cold. She picked it up, drank the rest of it, set the cup back down, perfectly centered on the ring it had already made on the table. Okay, she said. Okay. Well, what else am I supposed to say? She looked at him. What species? We'll get to that. Get to that now, she said. Not hard, not scared. Just clear, the way she got when something came at her sideways and she needed to figure out its shape before it got any closer. You have my mother's name in a file and you are telling me that my blood is flagging as something that has been extinct for 4 centuries, and you are in a room with me instead of 8 security officers, which means you don't think I'm dangerous, which means you think I'm confused. She looked at him steadily. I'm not confused. I'm waiting. Owen Ferris looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned the file around and slid it across the table so she could see the first page. The header read, Werk Integration Protocol, Dormant Expression Subject. Below that, her name. Below that, her mother's name. Below that, a name she didn't recognize. A woman whose dates ran from a century ago and who had lived, according to the registry, in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, married a man named George Voss, and died at 63 of heart failure. Her grandmother, a woman she had never met, who had died before Mara was born, who her mother had never spoken about in any way that stuck. 3 generations. All of them listed, all of them documented, all of them filed under a species designation she had never heard before today. She did not touch the file. She looked at it the way you look at a thing when you understand that once you pick it up you cannot put it down unchanged, and you need a moment, just one moment, to exist in the last second before that happens. The room was quiet. Somewhere beyond the door, the transit hub ran its ordinary machinery, ships docking, forms being filed, 10,000 travelers being processed and waved through and sent on their way with their blood untested and their names unflagged and their files closed clean. Mara put her hand on the table. Not on the file. Just next to it. Her hand was steady. She was good at steady. Start from the beginning, she said. Owen Ferris talked for 40 minutes. Mara asked questions when she needed to, which was less often than he expected. She had that quality, the ability to hold a large amount of incoming information without needing to interrupt it, to let it land and stack and settle before she responded. He noticed it. She noticed him noticing. Your markers are dormant but activating, he said. They began expressing 6 days ago based on the panel data. Before that, they were suppressed, consistent with the generational suppression pattern we see in the documentation. 6 days ago, Mara said. Yes. She was quiet. He waited. She didn't fill the silence. She let it sit there and she looked at the wall above his head, and she did not say what she was thinking, which was that 6 days ago she had been sitting in a hospital room in Darrow County, Ohio, holding her mother's hand while the monitors made their slow and inevitable sounds, and at some point between one breath and the next the sound had changed. 6 days ago exactly. She did not say this. What do the markers do? She said instead. We don't fully know yet. The Werk records are incomplete. The species was declared extinct after the collapse of the 7th corridor, and most of their biological documentation was lost. What we have suggests a broad-spectrum enhancement of base human function. Processing speed, sensory range, adaptive stress response. He paused. The integration was designed to be invisible, Ms. Voss, generationally invisible. A Verk genetic line embedded in a human population would produce children who looked and functioned as entirely human until the activation threshold was crossed. And what crosses the threshold? The pause this time was different, longer. Significant loss, he said. That's the current hypothesis. Significant enough loss to trigger the biological alarm system. The Verk built their integration protocol around survival instinct, not the individuals but the lines. When the protective layer is gone, the line activates, Mara finished. Yes. She straightened the files on her side of the table, all 4 of them. She aligned the edges until they were perfect, and then she kept her hands there, pressing lightly, as though the stack might move if she let go. Her mother had known. The file said so. The dates on the documentation said so. Somewhere in this file was a record of communication between her mother and this division, careful, infrequent, coded communication spanning 30 years. 30 years of knowing. 30 years of driving her daughter to school and teaching her how to cook eggs and watching television together on Friday nights and knowing. Mara did not open that part of the file, not yet. What do you need from me? She said. Currently, to come with us voluntarily for full diagnostic assessment. The activation is still in early stages. The markers are expressing but not fully engaged. We need to understand what you're going to become before I become it without supervision. Yes. She nodded once, the nod of someone who has received a reasonable argument and accepted it and moved on, the way you move past a thing in the road by walking around it rather than over it. All right, she said. All right. Sure, okay, fine. She pushed the file back toward him, not away toward precise returned, but I want copies of everything in there. Ms. Voss, some of those documents are. Everything, she said, flat, final. The voice she used when she was not negotiating, only informing. She was my mother. Whatever she knew about me is mine. Owen Ferris looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed the file and stood and moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused. For what it's worth, he said, the suppression was documented as voluntary, your mother's and her mother's before her. He didn't look back at her. They chose it, every generation. The door opened. The noise of the transit hub came through briefly and then was cut off. Mara sat in the cushioned chair in the quiet room with the empty cup and the ring it had left on the table. She pressed the ring with one finger, traced the circle of it. Her mother had grown tomatoes that never came in right. She had driven that truck for 12 years because it still ran, and there was no reason to replace a thing that still ran. She had read 3 books a week and remembered all of them and made the best scrambled eggs in Darrow County and known, every single day, that her daughter was something the galaxy would eventually come looking for. And she had not said one word. Mara sat with that. She sat with it until she was ready to stand up. Then she stood up, and she went through the door, and she did not look back at the cup. The ship they transferred her to was called the Halcyon Ridge, which was the kind of name that tried too hard to sound calm. Research military hybrid midsize, the sort of vessel that had too many locked doors for science and too many labs for combat and satisfied nobody fully, which probably meant it was doing something genuinely useful. Commander Edris Tone met her at the docking bay. Cedral, 4-armed, built like someone had designed efficiency and then built a person around the concept. He did not smile. Cedral faces weren't structured for it in any way humans recognized, but he nodded at her with what she was beginning to understand was his version of acknowledgement. Ms. Voss. Commander. Your quarters are on level 3. Assessment begins at 0600. What kind of assessment? The kind that takes 2 days and leaves you knowing more about your own biology than you wanted to. She followed him through the corridor. The ship hummed around them, engines at low idle, crew moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had somewhere to be and knew how to get there. She counted the locked doors, 8 on this level alone. "Am I a prisoner?" she said. "No. A guest. An asset under protective observation." That's a very polished way to say what it means. Tone glanced at her. "What does it mean?" "Means you don't know what I'm going to do yet, so you're keeping me where you can watch." She said it without heat, just nomming a thing. "I've got no problem with that. I don't know what I'm going to do yet either." Something shifted in his expression, the Cedral equivalent of reassessment. "Oh, 600, he said again. She found her quarters on level 3, which were better than she expected and better than she deserved by any rank-based logic, which told her something about how they were classifying her that she stored away for later. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. They looked the same. Same bitten nail on the left thumb she had never managed to stop biting. Same small scar on the right palm from a fence post in the back field of her mother's property, age 12, the year she decided she was not going to cry about things that bled. Same hands. She turned them over. On the inside of her right wrist, where the screener had drawn her blood back at Velian 9, there was a small mark. Not a bruise, not a puncture wound. The puncture had healed. The mark was something else, a faint pattern, like a fingerprint pressed in light, already fading. She stared at it for a long time. Then she lay down on the bed without changing her clothes, because she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and she stared at the ceiling until the ship's lights dimmed for night cycle, and she let herself think about her mother. Just once. Just tonight. She thought about the tomatoes that never came in right, and how her mother had planted them every spring anyway, every single year without fail, because, and this was the answer she gave every time Mara asked, some things you kept doing not because they worked, but because stopping felt like the wrong kind of giving up. The ceiling was gray. The same gray as everything else. Mara closed her eyes. At 0600, she was already awake. The first test was reaction time. She sat in a chair with sensors on her wrists and temples while a technician named Dale, young, earnest, the type who apologized before doing things that didn't require apology, ran stimuli sequences on a panel to her right. She responded to each one. Dale looked at his screen. He ran it again. He looked at his screen again. "Huh," he said. "Huh good or huh bad? Huh, I need to recalibrate, because this is outside the human range, and I want to make sure my equipment is correct." He recalibrated. He ran it again. "Huh," he said again. "Yeah," Mara said. The sensory processing test came next. Range and acuity, filters and depth perception, frequency detection at both ends of the standard spectrum. She passed each portion. She passed them by margins that made Dale very quiet and very careful with his documentation, the way people get careful when they're looking at numbers they don't want to be responsible for reading wrong. "I grew up in a county with one stoplight," she told him during the frequency test, "and 2 dentists. One of them wasn't very good." Dale wrote down the test result. "Right. I'm just giving you context." "I appreciate the context, Ms. Voss." The pain threshold assessment was the one she liked least. Not because it hurt. The stimuli were controlled, calibrated, well within bearable limits. She disliked it because it required her to sit still and be the subject of something, and Mara had always been better at doing than at being done to. She endured it with her hands flat on her thighs and her face arranged into something neutral. The result came back in the top 2% of all recorded species tested. Dale did not say "huh" this time. He wrote the number down very carefully, then he closed his tablet. The activation markers, he said, not quite looking at her, are spreading. Dr. Ferris's term was blooming. I know, he told me. Do you feel different, physically? Mara thought about it honestly. Everything is a little louder, she said, and a little sharper, like someone turned up the resolution on everything by 10%. She paused. It's not unpleasant, it's just more than I'm used to. But more is going to keep increasing, he said quietly, based on the progression rate. She nodded. She did not ask where it stopped. She already understood that nobody knew. That evening she was in the corridor outside the crew mess when she overheard two Cedral officers talking through an open door. They were not being careless. They simply hadn't noticed her yet, and she had stopped walking because she heard her own file number in the middle of a sentence. She stood against the corridor wall and listened. They were discussing the Verk integration protocol, whether its design was offensive or defensive, whether a species facing extinction would build dormant biological adaptations into another species as a gift or as a weapon, whether the distinction even mattered if the result was the same, a population seeded with sleeping capabilities that woke up under the right conditions. One of them used the phrase delivery system. The other one said, more carefully, that the translation of the original Verk intent was still contested, and they should wait for the full decoding. The first one said, in the flat practical tone of someone who had been in military logistics too long, that contested intent didn't change operational classification. Mara stood in the corridor and breathed in and breathed out. She thought about Dale, writing down her numbers very carefully. She thought about the locked doors on level 3. She thought about the word asset, and the word observation, and the word system, and how language had a way of building a room around you one reasonable word at a time until the room was finished and you were inside it. She went back to her quarters. On her small desk, her cold cup of coffee sat exactly where she had left it an hour ago. She drank it. All of it. She had been given access, as part of her transfer agreement, to any non-classified communications her mother had sent to the registry division. Owen Ferris had sent the list of files to her personal console that afternoon. 16 communications over 30 years. One of them was a message, audio file, sent 2 days before her mother died. Sent to this ship. This specific ship, not the division, not a general registry address. This ship. Mara looked at the file. She looked at it until the ship's lights dimmed again, and the corridor outside went quiet. She did not open it. Not tonight. Tonight she sat in the dark with her sharper-than-yesterday senses and her spreading activation markers and her cold coffee, and she thought about a woman who planted tomatoes every spring because stopping felt like the wrong kind of giving up. Tomorrow. She would open it tomorrow. The attack came at 03:47. No warning. No build. The ship lurched once, a single hard motion, like something enormous had grabbed the hull and pulled, and then the lights went red and the alarms went up, and the calm, automated voice began telling everyone to move to emergency stations in the tone of a voice that had been specifically designed to not sound like anything was wrong while everything was wrong. Mara was already awake. She had been awake since 03:30, sitting on the edge of her bed, because something had been wrong for 17 minutes before the attack and she hadn't known how to name it. A pressure at the edge of her awareness, like a sound just outside the frequency range she used to have. The new range caught it. Her body had been sitting with it, waiting, the way it apparently knew how to wait now. She was in the corridor before the second alarm cycle. Dale was running past her in the opposite direction, tablet in hand, and he stopped when he saw her and looked relieved in the way people look relieved when they spot a known quantity in an unknown situation. "What is it?" she said. Armed boarding, 3 points of entry. He was already moving again. Level 2, Level 4, and the docking port on 6. Who? Unknown. They had our transit signature. They knew exactly where we were. He glanced at her once, the look of someone connecting two things they didn't want to connect. They came for something specific. That's what Tone thinks. Myra looked at the corridor ahead of her, then at the locked doors. 8 of them on this level. Where's Tone? She said. Secondary Command, Level 2. She went to Level 2. The ship was not in chaos, exactly. The crew of the Halcyon Ridge were trained and they were moving with purpose, and the difference between panic and action is whether people are running toward something or away from it. Mostly they were running toward, which she filed under encouraging. Tone was at the secondary command console with 2 officers when she arrived. He looked at her, and she saw the brief calculation behind his eyes: asset, liability, variable asset, and then he made a decision. Boarding team on Level 4, he said. 5 confirmed, possibly 6. They're pushing toward Level 3. Her level. Her quarters. Her files. What do you need? She said. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. I need Level 4 secure. I have 2 officers down there and they are not enough. She did not ask if he was sure about this. She did not ask if she was authorized or cleared or equipped. She went. Level 4 was 3 corridors and a stairwell. She knew the layout because she had memorized the layout on her first day, because that was what she did in new places. And right now, she was glad of it with a cold and simple gratitude that had no room in it for anything else. She heard them before she saw them. Or rather, she felt them, that new peripheral awareness, the expanded frequency range, catching movement and the particular signature of deliberate, armed human motion before it came around the corner. She flattened against the wall. The 2 Halcyon crew officers were at the far end of the corridor, behind a secondary barrier, holding a standoff with 2 of the boarders. The other 3 were flanking, coming around through the service passage on the left. She went through the service passage first. She did not think about what happened next in real time. She was in it before she had fully decided to be, which was either terrible decision-making or the activation doing what activation apparently did when given a problem with a clear shape. She was fast. She was faster than she had been 6 days ago by a margin she could feel in her own body the way you feel a gear shift. The same engine, higher performance. The moment when everything that was already there just ran at a different level. She was not a soldier. She had no training beyond what a rural Ohio upbringing provides, which is some practical problem solving, a high tolerance for discomfort, and a deeply seated stubbornness about giving up on things she had already started. She worked with what she had. The 3 flankers were down before they reached the main corridor. Not injured badly, she was precise about that in the way that surprised her, the way her body seemed to understand calibration without being asked. Enough to stop, not enough to be permanent. She stood in the service passage and breathed. Her hands were steady. She noted that and then moved on, because the main corridor still had 2 boarders in it, and 2 officers who didn't know help had arrived from the wrong direction. It took 4 more minutes. Then it was over. Tone was in the corridor within a minute of the all-clear. He stood and looked at the service passage, and the main hall and the very precise nature of what had happened here, and he was quiet for a long time. "You've had combat training," he said. "No." "Then what would you call what you just did?" Mara thought about it. "Problem solving," she said. He looked at her with that thing she couldn't name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more careful than either, the expression of a person who has just seen something they need to update their entire framework to accommodate. She left him to it. Back in her quarters, the files on her console were untouched. The boarders hadn't reached Level 3. Whatever they had come for, whoever had sold her location, they had not gotten it. Her coffee was cold again. She didn't drink it this time. She sat down at the console and looked at the audio file from her mother, and this time she thought about that word tones officers had used. Delivery system. And she thought about what Owen Ferris had said about adaptive continuity. And she thought about the 3 people now in medical being treated for injuries calibrated precisely enough to stop without permanent damage, which was not something she had consciously decided to do, but her body had decided it anyway. Her mother had known. And her mother had sent a message to this specific ship 2 days before she died, which meant her mother had known this was coming. Which meant the message was for this moment. She opened the file. It ran 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Her mother's voice came through, and it was exactly what it always was, warm and measured and a little tired. The voice of a woman who drove a 12-year-old truck and grew tomatoes that never came in right, and had carried a secret the size of a galaxy across her entire life without once setting it down. Mara listened. She did not play it again. She sat for exactly 7 minutes after it finished. The ship moved around her, settling into the quiet of post-emergency operations, checks and reports, and the particular exhausted silence of people who had been through something and come out the other side and were now accounting for the cost. She stood up and went to the deck. Tone was there. He looked at her. She looked back. "What do we need to do next?" she said. The Verk decoding team submitted their preliminary findings on the 8th day. Mara read the summary report in Tone's briefing room with Owen Ferris on her left and a xenolinguistics specialist named Dr. Petra Cole on her right. Petra was small, extremely precise, and had the quality of someone who had spent so much of her life translating that she had started to hear the gaps between words as clearly as the words themselves. Mara liked her immediately. The report was 12 pages. The relevant section was 8 lines. Verk Integration Protocol Primary Function. Adaptive Continuity via Cross-Species Relational Capacity. Integration carriers demonstrate enhanced ability to perceive, interpret, and mediate interspecies communication beyond standard diplomatic range. Purpose: biological preservation of relational intelligence across species extinction events. Classification: non-offensive. Architectural intent: bridge, not weapon. Bridge, not weapon. Mara read it twice. She read it the way you read something you needed to be sure about before you let yourself respond to it. Bridge, she said. Bridge, Petra confirmed. The Verk weren't seating soldiers. They were seating translators. The biological enhancements, the sensory range, the processing speed, the stress adaptation, they're all in service of one central function: the ability to understand what someone else is experiencing well enough to speak between them and someone who couldn't otherwise. She paused. They built you into humanity because they were dying and they didn't want to take what they knew how to do with them. Mara sat with that. The room was quiet. Owen Ferris had his hands folded on the table and was watching her in the way he had watched her since Velian 9, with attention and with something careful behind it that she had recently identified as guilt. "You knew some of this," she said to him. "We suspected. Before you found me." He didn't answer immediately. That was an answer. "My mother knew too," Mara said. "It wasn't a question. That's what the communication files were. She wasn't reporting to you. She was making sure you knew what I was before you found me, so that when you did, you'd have enough to protect me from the people who would read the enhancement data and stop at weapon." Ferris was quiet. "Was I right?" she said. "Yes," he said. "She was very clear about what she wanted from us." Mara nodded. Outside the briefing room viewport, the sector they had moved to was dense with transit traffic, dozens of ships moving on their various purposes, hundreds of species conducting the ordinary enormous business of a galaxy that mostly held together, because enough people kept choosing to understand each other instead of the alternative. She watched a small cargo hauler navigate around a Cedral dreadnought 3 times its size, and she thought about what it took to move through a space where everything around you was bigger and faster and more armed, and to do it not by being bigger yourself, but by knowing exactly where the gaps were. "There are going to be offers," she said. "There already are," Tone said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in, which was notable given what her hearing had become in the past 2 weeks. He had been very quiet on purpose. 3, currently. 2 government level, 1 private entity. What do they want? Access, replication research. In 2 of the 3 cases, direct service contracts. Which means what in plain language? They want you working for them. Mara turned from the viewport. She looked at Tone, then at Ferris, then at Petra, who had the grace to look slightly apologetic, as if the existence of the offers was something she personally should have prevented. "No," Mara said. Tone's expression didn't change. "All 3. All 3. He nodded once. He had the look of someone who had expected exactly this answer and had been hopping for it. "The offers will come again," he said. "Different shapes, better numbers." "I know." She turned back to the viewport. The cargo hauler had made it past the dreadnought and was moving clean and free on its heading. "They'll keep coming until I'm worth more to them as a problem than a resource. And when that happens..." She thought about 8 lines in a 12-page report. Bridge, not weapon. She thought about her mother's voice in a 4-minute recording, and the way it had said one specific thing that she had not repeated to anyone and was not going to repeat, because some things were said between the person who carried them and the person they were carried for, and not for anyone else. She thought about tomatoes that never came in right, and a truck that still ran, and a woman who planted things every spring, because stopping felt like the wrong kind of giving up. "Then I'll figure out what comes next," she said. "Same as always." The galaxy moved outside the viewport. It burned and drifted and conducted its enormous business with no particular interest in what one woman in one briefing room was deciding about her place in it. She watched it anyway. Petra said quietly, "Your mother's files, the full set. Ferris had them cleared for your access this morning." Mara didn't look away from the viewport. "I know," she said. "He told me." "Are you going to?" "Not yet." She put one hand against the cold surface of the viewport. Her reflection looked back at her, sharp and clear, the same face it had always been. Same bitten nail on the left thumb, same scar on the right palm. "I know where they are, that's enough for now." The room was quiet. Her reflection held steady in the glass. Outside, the cargo hauler's running lights went small and then smaller, and then disappeared into the traffic. One more ordinary thing making its way through a universe that was full of them, navigating by the knowledge of where the gaps were, and moving clean through every one. Mara stood at the viewport and breathed, and let the minutes stretch, and did not hurry the next thing. It would come. It always did. She would be ready. Not because she was built for it, though she was. Not because her blood demanded it, though it did. Because she was Carol Voss's daughter, and Carol Voss's daughter did not stop doing a thing just because it was hard. She pressed her palm flat against the viewport. The galaxy pressed back, cold and enormous, and full of things she had not yet learned to name. She was looking forward to learning them.